Working with as many different nonprofits as we do at Foundation Group, we get the opportunity to deal with many complex issues, and few are as complicated and confusing as copyright and royalty questions. In today's video, we're going to unpack some of the more common scenarios and how best to handle them in a way that works well for both the creator and the nonprofit itself. Hi, I'm Greg McRae, founder and CEO of Foundation Group, and welcome once again to our 501c3 University channel, where we strive to make nonprofit compliance understandable. Intellectual property, it's difficult to understand in the best of circumstances. That's why there's a whole area of law that specializes in it. And it gets a lot more difficult when you throw in nonprofit rules and conflict of interest concerns. But as a creator, you need to understand what your options are. And to best simplify the complexities, we're going to illustrate some fictitious examples, condensing some very common, very real scenarios. Stick with me, and I think you'll actually see this is pretty manageable. Jane Doe is executive director of Money University, a 501c3 organization that teaches people the principles of money management. Jane is not only executive director, but she's a founder, board member, and the primary instructor. Jane's also an author who has written 2 books about personal finance. Now, the board believes that her books, which were authored prior to the formation of the nonprofit, they would make a good fit to be sold by the organization to support its teaching program. There are also plans to have Jane create curriculum. Now, there are 2 parts to the intellectual property concerns and how best to approach them. The first are the books that Jane has already written prior to the nonprofit's existence and the nonprofit's plans to sell them. That's pre-existing content, and we'll look at that first. The second part is the curriculum that Jane will develop to be used in the classes as part of the nonprofit's programs. That's commissioned work. Now let's look at both of these situations. Our first take is the pre-existing works. The 2 personal finance books, they're Jane's intellectual property. She owns the copyrights because she had already written the books prior to the nonprofit's existence. They are perfect supplements to the nonprofit's program, but Jane has an obvious conflict of interest. How can the nonprofit take advantage of these resources without it resulting in unfair benefit to Jane? Let's examine some options and their impact on the situation. Option 1, Jane could give the copyrights to the 2 books to the nonprofit. Now, this is probably the easiest way to go, but it's not necessarily the best for Jane. The conflict of interest problem goes away, but Jane no longer has rights to her works. If she and the organization ever part ways, she can't simply reclaim the copyrights, nor can the nonprofit give them back to her. Option 2, Jane could sell the copyrights to the nonprofit. Now, this is possible but problematic. Because of the conflict of interest, Jane really can't have any involvement in the decision of the board to buy the works. That's difficult considering she is such a key person. But it's doable. Valuation would require an independent appraisal, which Jane would have to agree to. Plus, is it really plausible that Jane would not have been involved in the board discussion of the sale? This option can be really hard to pull off. Option 3, Jane keeps the copyright and donates wholesale copies of the books to the nonprofit. Now we're getting to what can work well, but even this can be a mess. Jane may not be able to afford to cover the cost of the inventory to donate the books. That's a problem. Option 4, Jane keeps the copyright and sells wholesale stock to the nonprofit. Now, this scenario can work, but because of the conflict of interest, Jane really shouldn't profit from this. That means selling at cost. And even here, we may have yet another problem. If Jane self-publishes, she may have direct control over wholesale distribution. But if she's working with a publisher, she may not have that control, making this arrangement difficult or impossible. Option 5, Jane keeps the copyright and allows the nonprofit to buy wholesale stock directly from the publisher or her print-on-demand service. Now, this is similar to option 4, but bypasses Jane. This is often a great way to go, but it's not always possible. To confuse matters further, the issue of royalties comes into play. If Jane has a publishing contract, she may earn royalties with wholesale and retail sales. Conflict of interest comes up again because Jane should not profit from these transactions. Now, there are creative arrangements that can be made, including contractually donating royalties back to the nonprofit or having the publisher forward royalties from the organizational sales directly to the nonprofit. Confused yet? It's a lot to consider, and I ran through those pretty fast, but we do have a companion article on our website that we'll link below, and that'll help you. Now let's look at the issue of intellectual property that doesn't yet exist, but instead is being commissioned by the nonprofit. It is essential that all parties be deliberate about these arrangements. Without an agreement to the contrary, the copyright ownership defaults to Money University. The reason is that Money U commissioned the work. This tends to be a very common situation. But what if Jane really believes that she deserves to retain the rights to the work she creates, even if it's commissioned? It is certainly a fair stand for Jane to take. She will invest many hours into its creation, but given the obvious conflict of interest, how should this be handled? Now, unlike pre-existing content, there's not a lot of options here. The best scenario would see Jane sign an agreement with the board that allows her to retain the copyright and give Money University a license to use the curriculum in its classes. Now, it's important to mention here that Jane would need to recuse herself from board action regarding this agreement. The license may or may not be exclusive also. In any event, Jane should not be paid for creating the materials, nor should she expect to receive any royalties from Money U. Ideally, Jane should not be writing on the clock either, seeing as she will be the ultimate owner of the material. Another question we're often asked is whether or not the license agreement should be time limited. Now, there's no right answer to that. Practically speaking, it just makes sense to put a sunset date on the license. It can always be extended. Another caveat we've occasionally seen put into such a license agreement is an automatic revocation in the event Jane is involuntarily terminated by Money U. As you can see, this is an enormously complicated issue, one that we deal with on an almost weekly basis, and this discussion barely scratches the surface of possibilities. Issues of intellectual property, copyrights, and conflict of interest that comes along with it are very complex, and failure to appreciate that complexity and the need for deliberate action regarding it could be very costly both to the creator and the nonprofit. Don't go it alone with these types of issues. Get competent help to make sure you're putting it together in the best way possible. Thanks for watching. Now go serve your community. Hey, do me a favor and don't navigate away just yet. We would really appreciate it if you would click the like button, as it really helps get our content recommended to more people. Subscribe if you haven't already, as we have great content coming your way on a regular basis. Finally, you can click the little bell icon to be notified of new content when we post it. To learn more about Foundation Group, you can always visit us on the web at www.501c3.org. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.